1 year after Donald Trump was elected president, and it's almost as if the United States has split up into two separate countries. One that is predominantly Republican with traditional values, and the other Democratic progressives who value social justice and diversity. Each side does not understand the other. Republicans call liberals social justice warrior snowflakes who push impossible utopian ideals, and liberals view Republicans as bigots, racists, and hicks. A year into the presidency that divided the nation, and each is no closer to understanding the other. As a byproduct, it's becoming increasingly more difficult to agree on issues that require the government to act, and the United States is not coming together as a country. One has to wonder, what would happen if America decided it was easier to become two separate countries? Today, Life's Biggest Questions asks, what if America split up? Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions. Don't forget to like and subscribe and let us know in the comments below what topics you would like to see next. Back when Abraham Lincoln was president, he struggled with trying to unify a country whose inhabitants felt as though they had irreconcilable differences. Back then, if you disagreed with the government, all you had to do was move away from Washington to the west. That is no longer an option, and now the United States and its inhabitants are again approaching irreconcilable differences. Conservatives are traditionalists. They value family, hard work, religion, and traditional values. Progressives value humanism, socialism, diversity, social justice, income equality, and feminism. If the United States split up into two separate countries, each nation would have a government that suits the needs of its people. There would be pros and cons to both systems of government. The progressives would enjoy things like free, government-funded abortions, firearms would be banned, and owning a gun would be a privilege reserved for authorities. Gun-related crime would also be a lot more uncommon in this country. Progressives would pay far more taxes, but receive a basic living wage, free healthcare, and free post-secondary education. The government would regulate the economy and permit all immigrants and refugees to enter. Greenhouse gas emissions would be regulated. The environment would become a top concern in this country, and clean energy would be the norm. The conservative country, on the other hand, would enjoy a free market system. Post-secondary institutions as well as healthcare would be private. Taxes would be low. Most would enjoy a higher income. There would be no government infrastructure provided for the poor or for the sick, or if there was ever a natural disaster. Many red states are the ones that require government aid after hurricanes. Yes, the populace would have more money, but they would not be as healthy as the progressives. Refugees and immigrants would be expelled and no longer allowed in the country. Minorities would leave the red country both by choice as well as not by choice. It is to be expected that those who represent the far right would make it increasingly difficult for minorities to feel safe in this conservative country. Furthermore, the environment would not be a top concern. There would be no government regulation of greenhouse gases, oil, coal, or gas production. Yes, there would be plenty of high-paying jobs in the energy sector, but those high-paying jobs would have to use their wages to pay for the health problems that would arise from a country with heavy pollution. So what did we learn? Despite the irreconcilable differences, it's the balance between the conservatives and the progressives that's necessary for the United States to function as one country. Progressives need to be able to tax a large body of hard workers. If those workers didn't exist, they would have no one to tax, and would not be able to provide a living wage or any other government-funded programs. Businesses would not want to remain in a country where the government regulated the economy. The vast majority of America's wealth is earned in big, blue cities like New York and Los Angeles. But businesses and manufacturers would likely leave the progressive country in search of a country with a free market system. On the flip side of things, statistics show that red states are nearly twice as dependent on the federal government as blue states. 20 of the 26 states that were most dependent on federal aid voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. Many of the states that need government programs the most are Republican states. Of course, the United States will not split up, no matter how much each side bickers. Each side needs the other, and the sooner that they both realize that, the sooner America can move forward as one country. What do you think would happen if America split up?
Sound the alarm. We've got a totally unlikely invasion on our hands. Ring 10 bells. Alert the media. Life's Biggest Questions is asking the unthinkable. They are pontificating on an absolutely unbelievable topic. That's what's going on in all your heads right now, isn't it? Don't worry. Nobody's claiming that a Chinese invasion is on the horizon, but what if it was? There's a lot to consider here. Wouldn't that be a lovely cherry atop our insane 2020 Sunday? Hello fellow friends and philosophers, and welcome back to the most mind-bending channel on YouTube, Life's Biggest Questions. I'm your voice in the void, Keegan Hughes, and today we're going to be taking a look at a question that implies plenty of mayhem. What if China invaded the US in 2020? Before we get started, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up and subscribe for more crazy questions. Perfect, let's begin. So, yeah. What indeed? China and the US are not close neighbors by any means. They're separated by over 11,000 kilometers, plenty of salt water, and quite a few countries, depending on the route you take. Any sort of invasion, especially one that took place on the ground, would require the mobilization of an insane amount of resources and people. To say it's unlikely is an understatement. Sure, there are other ways to wage war, but do they really qualify as an invasion? I'll leave that to the persnickety folks in the comments to squabble over. But before we get into what an invasion might be like, we should probably figure out the why. There's plenty to consider in the power struggle between the US and China. Tech-based clashes like the 5G controversy surrounding Huawei, as well as the current TikTok scandal, could be seen as firing pot shots at each other, but definitely not declarations of war. The closing of the Chinese consulate in Houston might be ground for more extreme action. And China has found itself in hot water lately over their placement of Uyghurs in questionable re-education camps. The crackdown on Hong Kong makes folks wonder too. A lot of these issues seem to put the onus on the US to make the first aggressive move though. China doesn't stand to gain a whole lot by sending troops into the States, although there is another situation that would rope the US in. Recently, the Center for New American Security ran a war game simulation that took a look at what might happen if the US and China went to war in 2030. So we're still 10 years away, but it's possible. The conflict would see the US and Japan join forces to combat China. It would begin with China sending soldiers to an island in the East China Sea. Utsurijima is part of the Senkakus, which is an island chain owned by Japan but also claimed by China. You can see how this might ruffle some feathers. This unauthorized occupation would be followed up by plenty of military intimidation from both sides, with China sending ships, submarines, planes, and drones, and Japan sending some ships and aircraft-backed marines. This is where the US would get involved, seeing as they've got a military pact with Japan. Aircraft carriers and more would be sent out, but they would instruct their assets not to exchange fire with China. But according to the simulation, fire is exchanged anyways. Thus begins a war unlike any we've ever seen. Of course, this simulation pushes combat off until 2030. Hostilities between the US and China are brewing, but it doesn't appear that anything too crazy will happen in 2020. But what if something did happen this year? There's lots to think about. Let's say China does decide to invade the United States. What would that look like? How would other nations react? What would the UN say? Let's get all this out of the way first. China really doesn't have any military allies. They have a friendship pact with Russia and sort of have a research and development agreement with Pakistan, but that's about it. If they wanted to head into the States, they'd be going solo. And of course, the US has a crazy patchwork quilt of allies all over the world. Whether they would step in and help when China attacks is another question though. For a long time, other nations looked to the US as the world's most powerful military, and the US was happy to send troops all over to establish bases in all sorts of places. So there is potential for some other folks to step in and say something following a Chinese invasion of the USA. Speaking of other folks stepping in and saying something, what would the reaction from the United Nations be? Over the past little while, China has increased its influence in the UN system. They were already a permanent member of the Security Council, and it seems as though the UN approves of its Belt and Road Initiative. With the amount of power it wields, China has appealed to other authoritarian nations and managed to secure more leadership through economic incentives. So when a member with so much clout behaves in dangerous ways, what can the UN actually do? I won't go too far down that road. Let's return to the original question and consider the logistics of a Chinese invasion in 2020. Wait, we said in 2020, right? Man, it's already August. That is not a lot of time to ramp up a full-scale globe-trotting invasion. China really has to put it in gear if they want to land troops by Christmas time. But let's talk manpower. Comparing the current militaries of both countries should give us a good idea of how the fight would go. Of course, the USA spends a whole lot of money on their military. $610 billion to China's $228. That's a lot of cash on both sides, but the US is definitely spending more. However, China pretty much doubles the States in active personnel and has 10 times the reserve personnel. In terms of land forces, the US and China are mostly evenly matched, but the US definitely has more armored fighting vehicles. Plus, the fight will be taking place on US soil, so that gives them a bit of an advantage too. The US Air Force outmuscles China quite effectively, but China's Navy seems to have the edge. And of course, nobody's got nukes quite like the US. Hopefully it doesn't come to that though. For China to send all of their military might over to the States, they would need a fair deal of time and organization. Really, it doesn't make any sense for China to send anything other than aircraft and possibly some large explosive payloads, but hey, we're asking what might happen if they invade. So off they go in their planes and boats, ready to fight a crazy battle. It probably wouldn't go too well for them though, as they're traveling a great distance to fight on someone else's home turf. Plus, get this. the USA has a secret weapon courtesy of China. That's right, it's very possible that Chinese troops would get infected with COVID-19 while fighting in America. The whole country's closed off right now and likely will be late into 2020. So by sending troops in, you're exposing them to the virus. That might end up damaging their morale and numbers. Not ideal. So in the end, a Chinese invasion would probably be pushed back relatively easily by US troops. It just doesn't make sense for China to invade, especially in 2020. But hey, the question had to get answered. Now, if China took on Taiwan or attempted to snag one of the disputed islands from Japan, there could be trouble. And being closer to home gives China the upper hand in that situation, but that's a question for another day. So there you have it. If China were to invade the US in 2020, they would likely be removed very quickly. It would send shockwaves through the world though, as two major world leaders engaging in combat is apt to do. Crazy, don't you think?
Now get ready, it's time to ask the question, what if Mexico invaded the United States? If you saw our video on what if Canada invaded America, you may have some idea of how this will go. That is to say, Mexico would have a bad time. You can simply look at the military budgets of the two countries to see how easy this would be for the US. Mexico has a military budget of roughly 10 billion American dollars, while the US has 68 times that, with a budget of $682 billion. So really, we could probably just stop this video right here, but just for fun, let's look at some of the other factors. One disadvantage Mexico would have is that their border with the United States is relatively small compared to the US-Canada border. This means that there would be less ground for the Americans to defend, making it even more difficult to mount an attack on land. While Canada may have had a small advantage in that they could choose where to attack from, Mexico would be funneled through a relatively small area, thus likely wouldn't be able to successfully invade the US by land. This leaves two options, the air and the sea. Unfortunately, they would be massively outmanned in both areas. In the air, the US has a heavy advantage. In 2017, the United States had a total aircraft strength of 13,762, compared to Mexico's 452, roughly 30 times the power in the air. So it looks like an air attack is out of the question. But what about the sea? Surprisingly, this is one of the areas where Mexico is closest to the US in terms of firepower. In 2017, the US was measured at 415 naval military assets, compared to Mexico's 143. With less than 3 times the firepower, the US actually isn't as far ahead as they are in other areas. But on the other hand, to put it another way, they have almost 3 times the naval assets. Plus, it should be noted that aircraft can engage in naval warfare as well, which means the US air superiority would make this an even more one-sided fight. So, outmanned on land, air, and sea. What other option is there? Say it with me, nuclear weapons. This is essentially the only way that Mexico could do any real damage to the US. However, Mexico has historically been in strong opposition of nuclear weapons. In 1967, Mexico signed the Treaty of Tlatelolco. Goodness, was that difficult for my dumb Canadian tongue to say. This treaty stated that they would not manufacture nuclear weapons. And more recently, in 2010, the government of Mexico turned over their highly enriched uranium to the US in exchange for a less enriched form that couldn't be used to make weapons. All this is to say that Mexico would be reluctant to use, and likely lacks the resources to make, nuclear weapons against the United States. And even if they did, they would be in for a world of hurt. All this is ignoring one glaring fact that puts this matter completely to bed. If Mexico attacked the US, they would be breaking so many alliances that the world would come crashing down on them. Even if the US didn't deal with them immediately, which they probably could, other allies of the United States would step in and make sure peace was returned. An attack on the US would be suicide, both for the soldiers and for the country as a whole. And now we return to our question, what if Mexico invaded the United States? Well, the bottom line is Mexico would lose badly. Heavily outmanned in the air, land, and sea, and lacking the nuclear capabilities to be a threat on that front, Mexico would be throwing rocks at a skyscraper. And that's not to mention the fact that NATO would step in and squash any attack pretty quickly. On the bright side, an attack from Mexico is roughly as likely as Donald Trump bringing about world peace. That is to say, it just won't happen. Let's find out. It's time to answer the question, what if Canada invaded America? Well, first things first. In terms of sheer military might, the United States has an enormous advantage, to the point where Canada would have essentially no chance at success. America has almost 40 times the military budget of Canada, and it really shows. With nearly 1.4 million active military personnel to Canada's 79,000, the US would have a significant advantage in terms of experienced personnel. The US also has significantly more military technology and vehicles, from aircraft to sea vessels. Really, in pretty much any metric you can measure, America has a huge advantage. The bottom line is, in a vacuum, the United States would wipe the floor with Canada. But the world is not a vacuum, and the two countries have a number of allies that could make this much more complicated. The United States and Canada are both members of the United Nations. This means that an unprovoked attack from Canada would be met with retribution not only from the US, which would likely be sufficient, but from other allied countries as well. So even if Canada was able to successfully neutralize the United States, which is unlikely to the point of being fiction, the US would soon be aided by allied countries. Unless America did something so evil that they lost the support of the United Nations, Canada would likely be significantly outnumbered. But would Canada have help from other countries as well? Some believe that it would. America has rather tense relations with a number of countries, including Russia and China. It may be that these two superpowers would jump at the opportunity to finish off the ever-dominant United States. This would kick off a third world war, bringing with it a whole lot of extra uncertainty, and potentially the end of the world as we know it. If World War III were to break out, there would be rather dire consequences. Scientific progress across the world would slow in the name of increased military research and spending. Countless lives would be lost, and global politics would be turned on their head. Canada's invasion would likely be seen in a similar way to the assassination of Franz Ferdinand that sparked World War I, thrusting the world into a time of danger and sadness. However, as previously stated, this point is mostly moot since it is highly unlikely that Canada would attempt or have any real success in war against the United States. And now we come to what is always a bit of a trump card in these discussions: nuclear weapons. If we're looking at a country with Canada's military strength taking on a country like America, they would possibly need to resort to nuclear bombs, something that few rational governments would allow. The use of nuclear weapons on the United States would be suicide for Canada, or perhaps kamikaze. The world would soon come crashing down if this was to occur, making it highly unlikely for this method to be used. Taking these factors into account, it does not seem like Canada would be victorious if they invaded the US. So let's talk about the more likely outcome. What if the invasion failed? If Canada was unable to overwhelm the superior American forces, combined with those of their allies, they would face some serious consequences. First, the losses would be significant. Human life would be lost in the failed attack and in any counterattacks from the US or allied countries. Furthermore, an unprovoked attack against such a close ally would be met with extremely severe sanctions, which would cripple Canada both economically and politically. The country would lose most, if not all, of its political clout after such a blunder. While it's possible that Canada could eventually rebuild and regain the trust of its former allies, it would be difficult to return to the happy position it currently enjoys. Not even Canada's experience in saying sorry could save it from these consequences. Now we return to our question: what if Canada invaded America? Well, unless there was some significant meddling from powerful governments intent on World War III, it would not look good for Canada. Or rather, it would look really bad for Canada. Not only is Canada outmanned and outgunned by their neighbors to the south, but an unprovoked attack would bring about severe consequences from the United Nations, and possibly the end of Canada as we know it. And a world without Putin is just not a world worth living in.
After Donald Trump won the US election, the Yes California Independence campaign wanted to begin an initiative to make it so that California became separate from the rest of the United States. The hashtag CaliExit began trending worldwide. It's extremely unlikely that California would separate from the United States, but let's imagine, at least for the next few minutes, what would happen if it did. Today, Life's Biggest Questions asks, what if California left the United States? Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions, the channel that imagines the impossible. I'm your host, Charlotte Dobre, and make sure you leave a like, subscribe, and ask us a question in the comments below. California would not be the first state to leave the United States. Back in the 1860s, 11 southern states seceded from the Union, but then they rejoined after the Civil War. For California to leave the United States, they would have to vote on a ballot in favor of leaving the United States. The Yes California Independence campaign wanted California to be recognized as a nation within a nation. The example they used was Scotland within the United Kingdom. But for the sake of this video, we will examine the possibility of California becoming its own sovereign nation. Instead of paying their taxes to the American government, Californians would keep all the taxes collected within their own country. This would result in a substantial budget increase because Californians have paid more taxes than they've received in federal payouts every year since 1995. That probably has to do with the fact that there are a large number of millionaires and billionaires living within California. Hollywood and Silicon Valley provide a large fraction of tax dollars to the American government. The tax dollars that were formerly sent to the US government would be used to build better, futuristic infrastructure. Imagine this: high-speed Hyperloop trains that would be built across the country, making long commutes a thing of the past. California would be adorned with skyscrapers that use green energy, with vegetation and plants growing within them. Each building would essentially be its own ecosystem. Californians would probably develop their own form of currency, perhaps a cryptocurrency. But as we saw with Brexit, leaving the European Union drastically affected the UK economy. The pound dropped to a 31-year low. As a result, Britain's economy was no longer the 5th biggest in the world, it became the 6th. That being said, the US dollar as a whole will also go down in value. One downside to California leaving the rest of the US is that Californians actually don't get their water from their own state. Most of the water Californians drink comes from Colorado, specifically the Colorado River. Snow and rain falls in the Colorado mountains, then flows down to California. It's been that way for 94 years. But if California left the United States, who knows what would happen? Perhaps Colorado would divert the water back to its own state, leaving California with the task of finding a different source. Perhaps all those billions of tax dollars would have to be spent on importing water from Colorado, or even Canada. Maybe California and Canada will become close trade partners, and import and export food, water, gas, and other goods within them. That being said, California's agriculture industry is huge, the biggest in the United States. It supplies much of the food to the rest of America. If Americans shut off their water, California could respond by shutting off the food supply, creating a trade war. This would cause the price of fruits and vegetables for the rest of America to skyrocket. Furthermore, the taxes Americans pay would also skyrocket to make up for the fact that they aren't receiving taxes from the wealthy Californians anymore. Maybe another economic recession would also take place. Furthermore, not everyone would give up their American passports willingly. Like with other examples where countries have broken apart, there would likely be many Californians who would flee California to keep being Americans. The thing is, the United States doesn't even recognize secessionists. Following the Civil War in 1869, the Supreme Court made it so that any state that rebelled against the United States would have to win a war against the rest of the country in order to be considered its own sovereign nation. And although California does have a huge military presence, it's an American military presence all the same. Californians would have to commandeer US bases like the Vandenberg Air Force Base and threaten the United States with ballistic missiles. Yes, California does have its own state military reserve, but it likely couldn't win in a war against America as a whole. In conclusion, a Cali exit probably wouldn't happen in real life. But that's what people said about Brexit and a Donald Trump presidency. Who knows what the future will bring?
Well, it could be for a handful of reasons. The state disagrees with how the country is being run and officially decides to put in a request to be an independent country. Maybe it's because the Senate, House, and President are all Republican. California is very democratic and one of the most progressive states in the country, at least when it comes to certain laws. Either way, somehow, some way, it's decided that America will be abandoning California, which means the state of California would now be its own country. There are other options though. It's possible that Canada works out a deal to absorb California, and we now have a similar situation to Alaska and the United States, where an entire country, in this case Canada, separates the northern state from the rest of America. More on that later, but first let's focus on what happens if California becomes its own nation. Would there be a Queen of California? Probably not, but I want to include as many references to songs with California in the title as possible. And if there was a queen, well, they'd probably be sleeping in a California king bed. Oh yeah, we're doing this. Odds are they would promote, if that's even the right word, their government officials into higher positions of power. Maybe the governor of California becomes the president. The California Supreme Court would of course be the nation's Supreme Court, and so on. The popular vote would likely be implemented instead of an electoral college system when it comes to voting who is in government. However, this would also affect America, as they would now be losing out on the 55 electoral college votes they normally get from California. Would they just remove the 55 votes altogether, or potentially divide them up equally among some other states? How they move forward will likely be up to the government, possibly the president, but likely a collaborative effort with all the higher ups. And speaking of the government, going back to California, it seems more likely than not that all state laws would officially turn into national laws. But that also means a lot of their issues would be national issues, and they would need to rely on themselves to take care of their problems. As we know, California has had their fair share of wildfires this year alone. And when they first asked the US government for some emergency aid funding, the Trump administration rejected the request. After the state appealed the ruling, the Trump administration reversed their initial decision and allocated millions of dollars to help those who were affected by the natural disasters. Those who lost their homes, had their businesses affected, and of course all the firefighters who literally put their lives on the line to put an end to the madness were just a few of the areas in which the money was to be distributed. But if California didn't have the American government to rely on, what would they have done? Odds are there would be serious tax hikes for anyone living in the new nation of California to make up for the loss of their former country. But that could really just translate into one national tax instead of having state and national tax, as most states still do. Still, that likely wouldn't be enough for the government to run off of. It's definitely possible they increase their taxes, but the state is already notoriously known for having incredibly high taxes. However, there is another way that the new nation of California increases their country's profits. And no, I'm not talking about creating a tourist attraction called Hotel California. As you likely know, California is on the west coast of America and borders the North Pacific, which just so happens to be where a lot of imports from Asia, specifically China, come in. In fact, California is one of the states which imports the most from China, and they tend to export their fair share of goods as well. Although the United States and China aren't necessarily on the best of terms, they're still one of the country's biggest trade partners. And although there are other ports in different states where the countries would be able to import and export, it seems California is the easiest. So is it so crazy that California, now literally coming between America and China, decides to impose their own import and export taxes for anything coming through the new country? This way they can increase the amount of money the country receives without having to directly affect citizens, and instead make the US and Chinese government pay extra fees or taxes if they want to use California to import or export. Now there's a lot more to unpack here than just how America and California would get along. As previously mentioned, odds are, if there was a split for whatever reason, the two governments likely wouldn't be so fond of each other, nor would they see eye to eye on much, which would potentially be the reason for the split in the first place. That being said, it's not like they would necessarily go to war with one another. And to ensure that, it seems the UN would officially invite the new nation of California to join them, and introduce the state as a country. Maybe they'd call it Californication? I don't know, I just had to somehow get that song title in this video. On a more serious note, California would need some sort of security, whether that means from other nations attacking, financially, or even in regards to the environment. As we know, LA has got a pretty gnarly smog issue, and I have no doubt in my mind California would want the help from as many nations as possible to combat the issue, rather than do it themselves. As they say, you could go faster alone or further together. To say that California would want things to remain as status quo as possible is an understatement. They'd likely want everything to remain the same, with the only difference being they're now an independent country and there's a border, which used to be state lines, that separate the former state from its native country. But it seems keeping things status quo wouldn't really be possible. California is home to plenty of major industries, which are a massive part of the country and the world's entertainment as well as innovation. First two that come to mind, Hollywood and Silicon Valley. Maybe given the current state of affairs with the pandemic, Hollywood and Silicon Valley aren't currently what they were just a year ago. But odds are they will bounce back, and once again become the go-to places for anything film and TV or technology respectively. Of course, there's no way of knowing how these areas and industries would be affected, say if California and the United States were to split. Some may want to continue living in California, as they've been there most or all of their lives. Others may feel they don't want to be part of a new nation, which really could go either way. Maybe it thrives and continues on, or maybe people realize that even though there's a song called It Never Rains in Southern California, sometimes it does. And it doesn't matter how many California girls you have running around, at the end of the day, it seems evident if the state of California were to be abandoned by America, well, things would likely look bleak, and here's why. As of this recording, California has surpassed 1 million coronavirus cases. Now, when looking at this question, of course, I could avoid the entire pandemic, but given that I've been basing the question on if it were to happen right now, then I obviously need to touch on the pandemic situation. Even though there have been lockdowns, mask mandates, and who knows what other protocols put in place to help stop, or at the very least reduce the spread of the virus, it seems California is having an incredibly tough time getting on top of things. This means that more lockdowns are likely inevitable, which means people are going to be out of work. As you can see, this is a chain reaction, as the people without work will need to be given some sort of government assistance. And starting a new nation while in the middle of a pandemic would likely be seen as incredibly problematic because, well, I don't really think I need to explain why this would be seen as an issue. Aside from the legalities of it all, the new nation of California wouldn't have the budget to do all that is needed to be done. This would likely lead to them being in debt and relying on other countries, most likely the United States, to help them out. As you can see with all the various factors and outcomes that could potentially take place if America were to abandon California, it seems it would be best off if things were just left the way they are. Now, that doesn't mean if California was its own nation, it wouldn't be able to survive. But given our current pandemic, in which California is really being hit hard, and of course all the other issues highlighted throughout this video, it seems fair to say that if California and America were to split, the state would never be what it once was. China is the third largest country in regards to its size, but as you likely know has the largest population, currently sitting around the 1.4 billion mark. And as powerful of a country as they currently are, imagine if they controlled more land, had an even larger population, and had even more resources at their disposal. For those of you unaware, America was first colonized back in 1607 when English settlers made it to Virginia. By 1620, more settlers would land in Plymouth, and by the 1630s, most of Massachusetts would be colonized. Around this time, China was under the Ming Dynasty, which was led by Zhou Yuzhen, or the Wanli Emperor. In total, Yuzhen ruled the dynasty for 48 years, making him the longest-lasting emperor in the Ming Dynasty. One of the most powerful and influential emperors of the Ming Dynasty, it wouldn't be until about the year 1600 that his power would slowly decline, as would the dynasty. But what if China and the Ming Dynasty reached a America before the British started to colonize? Would China be in full control of all the land? Maybe the Chinese settlers would start a new country, declaring independence from their home. Today on Life's Biggest Questions, we're asking, what if China colonized America? How's it going, guys? Welcome back to LBQ. I'm your host today, Jared Bronstein, and if you guys have any suggestions for questions, let us know in the comment section down below. We're open to it all, so don't be shy. Stick around to the very end of this one for some common replies from another video, but for now, let's jump right into it. Of course, the answers to this question would change drastically depending when China were to discover and eventually colonize America. For example, if they did so during the 1400s, say 200 years prior to the British reaching the land, things would be drastically different than if we looked at how things would play out, assuming they both reached the land within a few years of each other. For the sake of this video, we'll be looking at the latter, assuming that China stumbles upon America and has Chinese settlers slowly making a new home for themselves around the same time the British did. However, as previously mentioned, around this time, about the year 1607, the emperor of the Ming dynasty was seeing his power decline. From the year 1600 until his death in 1620, the Wanli emperor did a total 180, going from a fierce leader who helped grow the empire's economy and win many wars to a recluse. In a sense, he went on strike, no longer showing up to important morning meetings, stopped seeing his ministers, and gave most of his commands in a written form, distancing himself from the people. The reason for the change has been disputed, but it seems the most prevalent one is that he felt the son of his wife should be heir to the throne. Normally this is how things would go, but it seems the Wanli emperor impregnated another woman prior to marrying his wife, a maid who gave birth to a boy. This is where things get a little tricky, as it seems the Wanli emperor was set on his wife's son, which was technically his second boy, taking over following his death. But as it goes in a hierarchy, the firstborn son is always given the right to the throne, and aside from the emperor's officials arguing for this, his own mother was also for the idea of his firstborn son, the offspring of the emperor and the maid, to take over following his death. Now it's important to keep that in mind because around this time, about the year 1600 or so, China would likely start making moves to check out America. Hypothetically, of course, as we know they didn't, but for the sake of this video, keep in mind that while the Wanli emperor was learning of the new world known as America, he would also spend the next 15 years of his life trying to argue a case for his second-born son to take over. It would be a lot of stress for the guy is what I'm implying. And this would also be on top of leading 100,000 plus people, or maybe ruling. Either way, assuming that the Chinese decided to head over to America, much like the British, it's inevitable that they would have run into First Nations tribes. But here's where things get insanely tricky. The British went west, from Europe to the coast of Virginia and Massachusetts, which would be the east coast of present-day USA. China would have likely gone the other way, traveling through the Pacific Ocean instead of the Atlantic like the British. This would mean that the Chinese settlers would end up first approaching the coast of what's currently known as California, and assuming they did so around the year 1600 or even 1605, shortly before the British would first reach Virginia, could this lead to a possible war between the Chinese and British? As previously mentioned, the Native Americans would also already be living here. However, in 1542, the Spanish had also already discovered this land. Still, the Spanish didn't start to settle into California until the 1700s, and considering how they did trade with China, it's also possible that they could team up with China in hopes of colonizing the New World, presently known as the United States of America. During the 1600s, China was trading a lot of silk and porcelain to European colonies, and was very fond of silver, but around this time, the likes of tobacco and opium use also rose in China. Considering how the United States had plenty of tobacco, there is even more reason to believe that a Chinese takeover would be imminent. Considering how China had a strong army and likely would be taking land from Native Americans who would also have to fend off other countries trying to colonize their land, how things play out would depend on whether or not a deal could be worked out. It's possible that China tries to ally with the Native Americans, and rather than completely take over their land, offer to coexist. Again, there are a lot of what-ifs regarding this situation, and a lot of possible scenarios that could have played out. There's a scenario where the Native Americans and Chinese coexist, which could ultimately result in a new nation being born. There's also the scenario where the Chinese colonize the land completely, and it's possible this leads to a war with the British or possibly the European settlers who would eventually call America their new home. And there's also the scenario where, much like the European settlers who would colonize America, the Chinese do the same and break off from the empire, resulting in them creating their own nation. Of course, if any of these scenarios were to happen, history as we know it would be drastically different. For starters, it's likely that if there still was a United States of America, it wouldn't be nearly as large as it currently is. For example, during the American Revolutionary War against the British, when they controlled 13 colonies, most of the East Coast was settled in by European or New Americans, if you will. The majority of America was still home to Native Americans, meaning that, technically speaking, depending on how the Chinese settlers and Native Americans coexisted, if at all, it's possible the Native Americans would be dealing with fending off two completely different groups groups on opposite sides of what's presently the United States of America, assuming that at some point the Native Americans would realize they have a better chance of winning if they ally with at least one of these groups. For the sake of this video, let's say they team up with China. Now, the new American or former European settlers attained all 13 colonies between 1607 and 1733. However, if the Chinese Empire were able to work out a deal with the Native Americans, possibly trade in tobacco for silk, who knows if the settlers would have been able to take over as much land as they did. This would mean there wouldn't even be a war between the new settlers and Britain. Instead, it's quite possible that the Wanli Emperor, realizing his second-born son wouldn't be heir to his throne, sends his son to rule this newfound land. Of course, this wouldn't necessarily be an easy task, as the Native Americans likely wouldn't be so fond of having a complete stranger rule their land. However, after some initial pushback, it's quite possible the Native Americans come to terms that the two nations can coexist, which could potentially lead to a new formed alliance. If they were willing to accept the Wanli Emperor's second-born son as the emperor of their land, given the condition that their tribe's hierarchy wouldn't be affected, it's possible that both sides would come to an agreement. And this could lead to what's presently known as the United States of America to become a Chinese nation, or possibly a new nation where Chinese settlers and Native Americans live, and in a sense, create a brand new culture and society. Depending on how relations would be between the Ming Dynasty and this new land would determine how much growth they could potentially see. There's of course the idea that they work together and continue to grow, seemingly becoming one of the most powerful countries in the world, of course under the impression that they would end up controlling the present-day United States and China. However, as it appeared was the case back then, it's also quite possible the two have a good relationship, but it gets soured when the emperor of the Ming Dynasty feels he wants more control over this new land, or the Wanli Emperor's second son, again assuming he was the emperor of the land currently known as the United States, decides to create his own empire. As previously mentioned, all these scenarios drastically change everything we know about life and history. One thing, however, appears to be certain. Regardless of how things were to play out, if China did colonize America, there certainly would not be a present-day United States of America, and it's more than likely that the majority of the population on the land currently known as the United States of America would either be Chinese, Native American, or possibly both. Now, I can't say for sure, as it's possible while attempting to colonize, the Native Americans fend off the Chinese settlers, but ultimately end up losing the land to European colonizers. As I always say, guys, there's no way of telling for sure how things play out, but it sure is fun to speculate. This would have a significant impact on the culture of the US as well as every other nation in the world. The influence of Chinese settlers in the New World would have a direct impact on the Native American community, especially if they coexisted, eventually leading to an entirely new culture, likely fusing the two together. Who knows how far north or south the colonization would continue, if at all. It's possible that the empire in charge of both modern-day China and the United States tries to attack European nations from both sides, with the ideology of making all the land fall under one empire. But as I always say, all we can really do is speculate, as there is no definitive answer. History happened the way it did, meaning any other scenario we try to understand will stop there, and us trying to understand without ever really knowing 100% how things play out. Unless we got a time machine or a DeLorean, it's not happening.
America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Or at least that's what their national anthem claims. Of course, as soon as someone hears the word America, they probably can't help but think about a certain orange-faced man. But don't worry, I won't be talking about him today. He's made enough headlines for himself lately. Now, the United States is a country made up of 50 states. It is said that it's the world's most powerful country. They have had a pretty significant impact on the shape of the world. But what if one day you woke up and that entire country was just gone? Hey everyone, what's up and what's going on, and welcome back to Life's Biggest Question. Now, you may be wondering, who is this strange new voice that I'm hearing? Well, my name's Lindsay Ivan, and I'll be your voice of reason for today's video. What if America disappeared for 1 year? But before I begin, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up and subscribe to Life's Biggest Question for more thought-provoking videos. With that being said, let's dive on into the video. So, what would happen if America just suddenly disappeared? Well, being that it's such a big country with a population of 3, I think maybe, just maybe, we would realize that they went missing. This would cause a worldwide panic, with everyone fearing that their country would be the next one to just disappear off the face of the earth. Then, tons of countries would be faced with a harsh reality. They would suffer in many different ways, since they heavily rely on America. Let's take a closer look at this. America is said to provide more assistance to countries in need than any other country in the world. In times of natural disaster, the U.S. allocates money, resources, and aid to help the countries that are affected by these disasters. On December 26, 2004, a tsunami struck off the coast of Sumatra Island in Indonesia. This was a result of a magnitude 9.1 earthquake. Within 20 minutes of the earthquake, it caused 100-foot waves to crash down on the shoreline and kill 100,000 people. It is said that this is one of the deadliest disasters in modern-day history. Well, the leadership from America's Navy helped save thousands of lives in Indonesia. If US is the top country to provide assistance, if they disappear, who's going to step up to the plate? It may cause a bunch of countries to suffer. In Africa, the US plays a crucial role in helping young children receive the life-saving drugs that they need. Without them, the mortality rate would increase. Because of America's help, it is said that extreme poverty has fallen dramatically over the past 30 years. Life expectancies have rose, smallpox has been defeated, polio is close to being eliminated, and the amount of people dying from malaria has been cut in half. On top of that, the US PEPFAR program has saved 17 million lives from HIV/AIDS and enabled 2.4 million babies to be born HIV-free. On top of that, thousands of people now have access to clean drinking water, education, shelter, and protection. The US also provides assistance for victims of war, violence, and famine. This shows you how much certain countries rely on America. If they disappear, so would their support, and countries would be left to suffer. Now, if America disappears, you know what else would disappear? Well, what device are you using to watch this video? If it's an Apple product, say bye-bye to it. Also, the website you're using right now, YouTube, you can also kiss that goodbye, along with Google, Facebook, Twitter, and Netflix. All of these services have headquarters in the US. Google, Twitter, and Facebook are all connected to Cisco Systems, which is an American networking hardware company. It sells the network's hardware, software, and other devices that these services use. Any iPhone users out there? Well, you won't be using that anymore. iPhones are designed in California, and that's where the Apple headquarters are and the research and design facilities. Also, 100% of fundamental smartphone operating systems are made in the US, such as iOS, Android, and Windows Mobile. Lastly, tons of our favorite shows that are filmed and produced in the US would be no more. Yes, I know it's devastating to say, but no more America's Got Talent. Do people even still watch that show? Let me know in the comments below. Okay. Enough with the bad news, let's move on to something more positive. So, on a lighter note, if America disappeared, so would their negative impact on global warming. Greenhouse gas emissions would be immediately reduced. America is said to be the second biggest polluter in the world, the first being China. Historically, the US is responsible for more emissions than any other country. It is responsible for almost a third of the excess carbon dioxide that is heating the world. Now, a reason being is because consumerism is so high in the States. You see big events like Black Friday. People are always wanting bigger and better. They're always upgrading to get the biggest and best model of everything. Once they're done with one thing, they just throw it away and they're on to the next product. It is said that the average American throws away 4.4 pounds of trash daily. That means that around 1.4 billion pounds of trash gets thrown out in the US every single day. That is crazy. On top of this, the US military is a huge polluter. In fact, it is said to cause more pollution than 100 countries combined. In 2017, the US military bought about 270,000 barrels of oil a day. Its fuel usage alone results in more carbon dioxide than most medium-sized countries. With all this being said, if America disappeared, we would see the nature of our Earth drastically change. Mother Earth would be subject to less pollution, less toxic gases, and climate change would slow down drastically. The next point I want to touch on is the world's economy. Sadly, without America, tons of countries would fall into a recession. America has the world's largest economy. Its economy constitutes 1/4 of the world's economy. On top of that, the US market is the world's biggest spender. China's economy might potentially collapse because America is their biggest customer. They rely on the imports and exports of goods between the US. In fact, America employs a lot of workers in China because of low labor costs. If they disappear, then tons of people would be left without jobs and would lose their source of income. Also, companies that relied on parts from America will have to stop their production and may have to close down their factories and lay people off from work. On top of that, thousands of individuals may starve to death. The US exports about $133 billion worth of food a year. Countries that export products to the US will also be left with an excess of products since there would be less of a demand for it. For example, the US imports most of its beef from Australia and Canada. Well, if they are no longer there to import, then we'll be left with tons of beef and nowhere to ship it to, meaning tons of it will go to waste. On the plus side, less cows will then be killed. Now, what about our favorite brands like Nike, Levi's, and Coca-Cola? Well, although they are manufactured elsewhere, they are created and marketed and launched from the US. Anyone out there a fan of Jack Daniels? Well, it's the top-selling American whiskey. It's produced in Tennessee, so you can kiss that goodbye. Then you have the company P&G, which stands for Procter & Gamble. They are an American company located in Ohio. They have products such as Febreze, Charmin, Crest, Olay, Pampers, and Pantene. All of these products would become unavailable. On top of that, agriculture would suffer for countries that rely on John Deere. John Deere is an American corporation that manufactures agricultural, construction, and forestry machinery. Now, I got some bad news for all you car lovers out there. A bunch of your favorite cars are assembled in the States. America gets their parts from other countries, but then assembles them in the States. Another important point I should discuss is the US military. They have a huge and powerful military. A lot of countries rely on their service. Without their service, it could result in more wars. The US military also provides countries with military financing. It provides countries in need with access to defense equipment, services, and training. Then you have their peacekeeping operations. For example, in South Korea, the US military has helped with their national security and economic development. And of course, we rely on their services from deterring threats and keeping us safe and protected. Now, how about space exploration and travel? Well, without NASA, we would lose all of our progress in space exploration. And we would also face a setback in the development of key medicines, since there are tons of medical research facilities in the US.